And it's my pleasure, very great pleasure, to be able to introduce to you Professor Ratna Kapur, who is, I think, basically from India, because you have a CV which is so huge that I will not be able to inform you about this very long and very diverse experience you have, which is perhaps an indication of what feminism has also been about for these last many decades. It's about diversity, and about diversity in experiences, in different kinds of jobs. You have had, if anybody wants to go to the websites and look, which I did earlier today, it's overwhelming. So you have given us directions about what to tell about you, and I will do that, but maybe I may add a bit more. You write in your mail today that your affiliation, your main affiliation, is as a professor of law at Jindal Global Law School in New Delhi, India. I checked it. It's about 20 kilometers, I think, 40 kilometers from the center of New Delhi. It's a very recent university from 2009. It's a private university. It has very fancy buildings. And it is very, very globally oriented from what I can see. It really is a university which is timely for this century, a globally oriented university. Apart from that, you also write that you have a long-term visiting appointment as a professor of law at Queen Mary in the University of London, which is East London, which is also a very internationally oriented university, as London, of course, is in general. And your other affiliation is as senior faculty on the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School. You have also been working, you have been a visiting professor in many different places, at Yale, at Geneva School of Diplomacy. You have also been, I think you still are, director of the Center for Feminist Legal, you're not, but you have been, Feminist Legal Research in Delhi. You've been senior gender advisor with the United Nations mission. You have worked with international law, human rights, feminist legal theory, post-colonial theory. You have been just closer to home a visiting professor at the University of Helsinki. So I think you have this, what I would think we also see, especially among feminists and law professors, or professors generally, academics with a feminist background, this global and diverse experience, and you are drawing upon that, of course, today, moving beyond Cologne is part of the title of your presentation today. So I very much look forward to hearing what you have to tell us and to hear you challenge us. Thank you.
Anyway, I am enormously honored and delighted to be here as a speaker at this exhilarating conference, and it is indeed very challenging because it brings together three huge ideas and challenges us as keynote speakers to try and attend to those ideas in ways that are accessible and not too complicated, while at the same time, as Hilda said, pushing you out of your comfort zone, which I intend to do, I hope, today. I do want to thank the Faculty of Social Sciences, the Department of the Danish Institute of Human Rights, and the Coordination for Gender Research for everything they've done to make my visit possible, and I'm just incredibly comfortable as well in staying. Okay, so the title of the talk, and I'm going to go on for about 45-50 minutes. We have to 5:30 or 5?
Yes, we do.
5:30?
According to the program.
Okay, well
But don't
anyway,
feel
when I
obliged.
finish, I really want questions because that's, I'm hoping to leave space for that. The title is Bodies That Matter, taken from the very well-known book by Judith Butler. Precarious Subjects, Human Rights, and Moving Beyond Cologne. Well, on New Year's Eve, as many of you know, in 2015, hundreds of women were sexually molested during a celebration near Cologne's Central Cathedral and main train station. The headline news splashed around the world suggested that most of the assaults were carried out by Middle Eastern or North African looking men, making the attacks, in fact, a turning point for Europe's refugee debate. It quite specifically led to a serious questioning of the Merkel government's open door policy, where Merkel basically sits alone, where she allowed hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing from conflict zones, mainly Syria and Iraq, to enter the country. These images are prolific, they're all over the internet, and they are representative of the thousands and thousands of refugees that are in fact pouring into Europe. While only 3 of the 58 men ultimately charged as suspects were refugees, the racial origins of the perpetrators, who were mostly non-white, non-German citizens, was immediately collapsed with Islam, raising alarming charges such as the Islamic rape of Europe in a popular Polish magazine. Here you see brown hands mauling a white female body. Or images of Alan Kurdi, the little 3-year-old Syrian boy who died crossing the Mediterranean in September 2015. He's depicted here as a sexual abuser in adulthood had he survived the Mediterranean crossing in Charlie Hebdo, the French satirical magazine that has become the beacon of freedom of free expression globally since the January 2015 attacks in Paris. The caption reads, "What would little Alan Kurdi have grown up to be? Ask Roper in Germany." Given that sexual violence against women, as well as we all know, rarely triggers this level of alarm or even interest, even in Germany, we have to question whether it was the nationality and the religion of the attackers rather than the horrid treatment of women that was more at stake. The hashtag #RapeRefugee applied by Pegida, the extreme right-wing movement in Germany, along with many others you'll see here, irresponsibility, crime, stop the migrants, stop invasion, suggests that the victims merely become part of the background of the discussions. The dominant narrative, supported partly by the media, is that sexual violence is a crime committed by others, non-white, non-European, Muslim men, who come from elsewhere. This familiar Orientalist discourse from the past is coupled in the contemporary period with an Islamophobia that is rife in Europe and has flourished ever since 9/11 and strengthened by the subsequent attacks in Western Europe. Let me contrast this narrative with another. Just before International Women's Day in March 2014, the Indian government banned the screening of India's Daughters, a documentary produced by UK-based filmmaker Leslie Udwin on the 2012 Delhi gang rape and death of a young Indian woman that received global attention at the time. In a rarely seen response during that period, specifically on the issue of sexual violence, thousands and thousands of young men and women marched onto the streets of major metropolitans throughout India, protesting against the pervasiveness of sexual violence against women. However, in the documentary, Udwin's interview with the defense lawyers recording their blatantly sexist remarks, where one of the defense lawyers compares women to a flower that needs protection, and if she falls into the gutter, she gets spoiled. If she is put in a temple, she's worshipped. As well as with one of the convicted rapists and killers, who justifies the rape on the grounds of the woman's dress and behavior, being out too late at night. This representation ignited a furious reaction that spiraled into being about the denigrating representations of Indian men by a white Western female filmmaker who had hurt the sentiments of the nation, of the Indian nation. In response, the filmmaker appealed, the filmmaker appealed to no one less than Prime Minister Narendra Modi and member of the extreme Hindu Right Nationalist Party, controversially praising his stand on women's rights, as well as India's civilized democracy, to screen the film. Also on the ground that she'd left her young children and comfort of her home to spend 2 years to make this film in the public interest of women. The film was ultimately banned on the grounds that it posed a law and order problem. However, one segment of the feminist community in India supported the ban, partly on these very grounds that they objected to the Orientalist framing or white woman's savior complex that the film supposedly embodies, as well as its equation of poverty with violence, and for focusing on the views of the rapist. Much like the responses to the Cologne outrage, once again the issue came to be less about rape that was central to the initial protests, and instead driven by a nationalist narrative, opposed to a foreign woman's intervention built on what is perceived as a cultural, gender, and sexual imperium, informed by a colonial past. While Unwin's documentary is in fact deeply problematic on many levels, the ban denied other Indian feminists, such as myself, and those who opposed the ban, the opportunity to critique it, and detracted once again from the central issue, that is, the issue of sexual violence. Now, I set out these two stories to illustrate the deeply problematic responses in both instances where racialized and gendered bodies are mobilized to advance arguments around national identity. At one level, they represent old fears and tensions from a colonial era that continues to fester and get reinforced in the post-colonial present, where the racial other is constructed as an eternal predator, libidinous, and rapacious, or where bodies of third world women are constantly perceived as truncated subjects, victimized and awaiting rescue from these same barbaric men and a backward culture by a white savior. The racist response to the Middle Eastern and black man in Cologne, and the nationalist response to a white woman documenting rape in India, can only be comprehended through this post-colonial lens, which I'll elaborate on through the course of this lecture. While both these stories seem to local, they don't run parallel to the global, but instead are in fact integral and sustained by the global. So I use these two narratives really as the starting point of my talk today, where I discuss how precarious subjects get taken up and circulated in discourses that construct specific bodies, as well as our responses to them within human rights advocacy. I argue that precarious subjects are addressed within an already existing racial, cultural, sexual, and civilizational differences that inform the international human rights apparatus. It's the scaffolding for human rights. Central to this analysis is how the colonial imaginary in relation to the other bodies continues to inform human rights advocacy in the post-colonial present, and how such interventions obviate the possibility of human rights being either a radically transformative project or of precarious subjects actually being liberated through this endeavor. My talk has three parts. First, I discuss precariousness and briefly trace the genealogy of how some bodies come to be recognized as experiencing injuries and harms that are deemed as unjust, reparable, and remedial, and others not. I examine how this analysis informs contemporary human rights advocacy in relation to gender, alterity, that's cultural difference, and sexuality. That is, how these precarious subjects are managed and governed, specifically illustrating my argument in the context of the sex worker, the veiled woman, and the homosexual. How does the human rights discourse establish a hierarchy of bodies, while simultaneously marginalizing other understandings and beliefs of how to be and to be free in the world? And third, I asked what this analysis can bring to our understandings of gender and sexuality and difference, and how we can move beyond the destructive binaries that inform this advocacy, including having a more reflective, respectful, thoughtful engagement with non-liberal epistemes. So let's talk first about the idea of precariousness. In Precarious Life, Judith Butler argues that some lives cannot be apprehended as grievable or lost if they cannot be apprehended as living. She questions under what conditions does it become possible to apprehend a life as possible. She states, this partly depends on that life being produced according to norms that qualify it as a life, or indeed as part of life, and that there are subjects who are not quite, or indeed are never recognized as lives. I borrow from Butler's discussion on precariousness to examine how certain harms and injuries in relation to gender and sexuality come to be recognized in human rights law as unjust and deserving of repair and remedy. An obvious prerequisite is that the body in question be recognized in the first place as a subject, and such recognition, in turn, is based on a set of norms that determine those bodies which can be recognized as subjects and human, and those which cannot, or which are given less recognition. So I argue that human rights produces actually a hierarchy of human bodies, that is, who is more or less human, who is inhuman or unthinkable as human, and of course, who is superhuman. When a human is not recognized, her body becomes nothing, a cadaver, like a slave with no being. Without recognition, we're left with the corpse of a non-being, one that becomes wash-awayable without any further adieu. I think represented here in quite graphically in Ai Weiwei's representation where he had 14,000 salvaged refugee life vests wrapped around the pillars of the Berlin concert house. And if you are not recognized in law or in human rights, you become subject to greater precarity. For example, historically, in the case of black African slaves, their subjectivity was recognized only to the extent that it advanced the civilizational and development goals of slave-owning societies. In a legal case that was one of many, in 1803, 301 East African slaves were transported in the walk-in as a Portuguese slave ship from Mozambique to Montevideo. Only 30 arrived alive in their incarcerated hole at their destination 6 months later. The slave ship had become a floating tomb. While a lengthy, drawn-out legal battle followed with the slavers and the purchasers trying to recuperate their losses for their dead cargo, doctors testified before a royal commission that the slaves had died as a result of dehydration and chronic diarrhea, combined with the psychological hardships of slavery. Their humanity and subjectivity came to be recognized and located in the diagnosis that the slaves had wasted away emotionally. It was the discoverer of melancholia, mourning and brooding, a sadness that had overcome the captives when they realized they were forced to leave behind families, their homeland, and their freedom. Affect and expression of feelings were signs of humanity, but these did not serve as entitlement to legal subjectivity and rights. This data and diagnosis that led to the recognition of the slaves' humanity was not used to advocate for their emancipation, but to further the cause of medical science and the exploration into the causes of mental illness. The only benefit to the slaves, if it can be called that, was that the slave owners were advised to get their slaves off the ships as soon as possible before the conditions of nostalgia manifested. This slave body is constructed as both abject and object, and her life is a form of what Mbembe describes as death in life. The loss through death or damage of the object is to the master, who loses an instrument of production or property. The slave had nothing to lose, as there were either no human there in the first place or no life, and hence she cannot experience injury or harm or erasure. The bodies are disposable and ungrievable. If this is the case, then it also renders the idea of a universal subject in human rights as not realizable or realizable on terms that are exclusive. So the idea that the human being is something that is assumed and noble in advance and serves as a grounding entity is actually put into crisis. Instead, it becomes part of the problem that requires investigation and interrogation. The rendering of the other as non-human or subhuman and as an object of sale or torture continues in the contemporary moment, so it's relevant even today. Linked to the Cologne story with which I began, we have witnessed how scores of refugees have poured into Europe, many to escape the single-minded destruction of their homelands, not only at the hands of their governments and extremist groups, such as ISIS, Islamic State, but also the incessant rain of bombs that are dropped by lethal air power by liberal democratic countries, amongst others, who claim their interventions serve humanity and is a just war, or as a form of retaliation for the attacks in Brussels and Paris. Here we have François Hollande declaring France is at war with ISIS in November 2015. And right after that, the bombs were dropped on Raqqa, which is seen to be the headquarters of Islamic State, but actually also was an ancient civilization, or represented an ancient civilization. We have the images of Raqqa, as well as the Hellfire missiles with the inscription on them, "From Paris with love." Such destructions are justified within a logic that bold military interventions may be required as the best hope to save liberalism and democracy from the chaotic violence of feudal, illiberal societies that are the source of evildoers, such as terrorists. Somewhat like the black slave, the body of the refugee is objectified in this discourse, to be repackaged today, we know as a result of this recent agreement, and sent back to where they came from, or at least the first place where they came from before they entered mainland Europe. And if they are allowed entry, their journey becomes more dehumanizing when countries such as Denmark make it legal to seize the cash and valuables above a certain amount from those who have already left almost everything behind. This is Steve Bell's representation of Prime Minister Rasmussen, the caption reads, "It's offensive to compare us to the Nazis." That's what was, circulated in the press when, in fact, this law was adopted. And if she is a refugee, well, then she must pay for her plight through her plight. While these measures may violate human rights, such rights belong only to humans, as I've just discussed. In this instance, what seems clear is that the refugee does not comply with the criteria of being fully human. A potential economic burden, a swarm of rats in this very controversial front-page cartoon by the Daily Mail, which is actually reminiscent of a 1939 cartoon which shows Jews as rats and being barred from entering Europe. As culturally unassimilable, lusting for Europe's women or Europe's riches, a threat to Europe's Christian identity, as the Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán said at the very beginning of the refugee crisis, or worse, a possible terrorist. In all these instances, lesser humans, but not human. These attitudes are partly reflected once again, in the Hebdo cartoon, where, once again, Alan Kurdi expired so close to his goal, and the goal being a McDonald's 2-for-1 special for infants. And Europeans walk on water, proof that Europe is Christian and Muslim children sing. These droves of bodies are redirected back to where they came from, not in the interests of their human rights, but the human rights of those in Europe, where the Paris and Brussels bombings or the Cologne sexual assaults become the shocking evidence of how human bombs and uncivilized hordes may lurk amongst these masses. These acts become the justifications for keeping such people out, or to impose restrictions on their mobility. I want to turn now to demonstrate how this logic operates in human rights advocacy in relation to gender alterity and sexuality, and build on the ideas of bodies that matter and those that don't, those who are denied protections that the liberal state normally considers essential to an individual's humanity. How are some bodies normalized in and through the discourse of human rights, while others are reprimanded, vilified, incarcerated, or erased? This cast includes the sex worker, the veiled woman, and the homosexual. In the international human rights arena, gender advocacy has been largely framed within the logic of campaigns confronting violence against women. The turning point came in 1993 at the Vienna World Conference on Women, which recognized that women's rights were human rights, and that violence against women in the public and private sphere should be subject to human rights scrutiny. States have responded to the recognition of sexual violence, sometimes a bit too enthusiastically in fact, but largely through an overall strengthening of the law and order agenda and a tighter focus on criminal justice provisions. This carceral vision has been acutely evident in the area of anti-trafficking interventions, where the intensification of border controls, raid and rescue operations by law enforcement, and zero-tolerance campaigns in these posters and others, which are more global, aimed at targeting individuals who are engaged in sex trafficking, and these are amongst the dominant responses by state parties, and have actually, in my view, contributed to what I have called the emergence of a sexual security regime. The central casualties in this vision have been sex workers and migrants. While I allude to the implications of these interventions on migrants, my focus would be primarily on the sex worker, where there is a consistent and continuous effort on the part of a large number of states, and they are supported by one segment of the feminist movement as well in different parts of the world. But in a large number of states, most recently in France actually, to embrace what is referred to as the Nordic model in relation to sex trafficking, that criminalizes the clients of the sex worker and various other aspects of the sex industry. The sex worker is recognized only as a victim to be rescued and rehabilitated, where her very livelihood is regarded as violence. And these interventions overwhelmingly target women in the global south, despite the fact that actually sex workers in the north and the south oppose this. In France recently, French sex workers opposed the move to criminalize clients, and here Indian sex workers argue that trafficking can only be stopped by decriminalizing sex work. In this model, then, the one that's the Nordic model, the criminalizing process becomes the end goal of human rights, and the very framing of the sex industry through the lens of trafficking erases all subjectivity and choice. And here's a popular poster by the US government of trafficked women represented as bottled and sold on grocery shelves, and you see these mostly in many of their embassies around the world. The ends of justice lie in dismantling the very structure of the sex industry and erasure of the sex worker as legible or eligible in human rights, or only eligible as a victim to be rescued. In addition, these campaigns are powered by stereotypes of poor or third world women as incomplete. Once again, two-dimensional subjects who are forever falling victim to trafficking, violence, death by culture, and are therefore in perpetual need of rescue by their superhuman, heroic, liberal feminist sisters, like the super heroine Wonder Woman, who's usually wearing stars and stripes like that. It is this kind of problematic assumption that fuels the kinds of responses that we saw, that I talked about a little earlier, the reaction to the film India's Daughters that I discussed earlier. And these rescue missions have resulted in the wretched of the earth, to use Fanon's phrase, ending up in destitute homes, juvenile centers, and inadequate government shelters. And here's the rub. Somewhat paradoxically, these interventions have also encouraged the establishment of an unregulated, clandestine migrant mobility regime, precisely the thing that they were trying to stop, which includes migrant boats, where the migrant risks becoming a perishable commodity under what has been described as a let them all drown policy. And here, where if she drowns, she's a refugee. If she lives, she's an economic migrant, creating quite a dilemma. Apart from the fallout of the anti-trafficking interventions, the economic and social structural forces that encourage migration, including unsafe movement, when safe legal passage remains unavailable, are just not addressed. Anti-trafficking interventions really, they bypass what is the central problem. They constitute part of the, in fact, larger framing of sexual violence, which has been the core issue in women's human rights advocacy within the broader framework of a security discourse that involves increased sexual surveillance, justifies militaristic agendas, and harsh punishments. This security focus, it's manifested in domestic jurisdictions, in women's human rights advocacies, and a death penalty, as was evident in the response of the Indian state to the Delhi rape, which introduced the death sentence for rape that maimed or led to the death of a victim, which was emboldened by some of the slogans and placards of the protests to the Delhi rape. So on one level, those protests were extraordinary in their sort of giving visibility to sexual violence, but at the other, there were also these reactionary elements within that very space. But encouraged by this broader security discourse within which now, not just women's human rights actually, within which human rights is increasingly being framed. My analysis is further complicated in the context of alterity, where human rights interventions produce an unequivocal choice between cultural identity or gender equality, which is really interesting because gender equality is one of the things that I think we are also very concerned about, as was mentioned by Maria at the very beginning. This is starkly illustrated, this choice is starkly illustrated in the context of Muslim women and the legal responses to the practice of veiling. Veil is jail. Legal regulations have imposed restrictions on wearing the veil to varying degrees in a number of European countries. And I really want to dwell on this obsession around the veil in Western European liberal democracies. There's this underlying assumption that freedom and equality demands its removal by the liberal democratic state, at least so the face is visible, but it's usually more than that. Where freedom is associated, of course, with the right to choose what we want to wear, except when it's the veil. In France, inclusion is open to those who demonstrate compliance with the assimilative terms of Republican secularism. This was the campaign during the first law, which was about banning of the headscarves in public schools. It was about the headscarf, but the representation here is of this fully covered face and this liberated face on the right of your screen. This practice is reminiscent of the French colonial state, where selective assimilation was available to those natives who were exceptional in their ability to demonstrate what's called French cultural competence. In this instance, we of course need to remember that the bans concerned French citizens who were Muslims and who were claiming that the veil was part of French identity. But the wearer's choice to wear the veil is either regarded by the state as some feminists as false consciousness, because it does not comply with an understanding of freedom based on autonomy and liberal individualism, or it is regarded as a belligerent act that refuses to comply with the reasonable demands of le vivre ensemble, or living together, as the legitimate aim of the protection of the rights and freedoms of others, as upheld where the European Court of Human Rights, as stated by the European Court of Human Rights in 2015, which upheld the burqa ban in France. That was the second ban dealing with the burqa in 2010. To choose the veil over the non-veil is to choose incarceration over autonomy, and hence no choice at all. The very terms of gender equality are used then to deny the veiled woman's agency, and here's very important to capture, to align equality with the rule of the majority and with the normalized, unveiled, sexualized liberal subject. Thus, the invitation into the liberal democratic space, which is cast as a civilized space, as one of the end goals of the Human Rights Project, is not necessarily an invitation into a space of lasting freedom and equality, but one that seeks to incorporate the sexual or gender other into a regulatory normative order that ensures certain types of cultural, sexual, gender arrangements are reinforced, while alterity or difference continues to be muted, stigmatized, penalized, or marginalized. The veiled woman's choice to wear the veil is never attended to and remains unintelligible within a liberal imaginary, nothing more than a body bag from which the body must be liberated, or it must be removed completely from public view. Veil is jail. From the perspective of the other, the one who wears the veil, it may represent an urge by immigrant women or citizens against the assimilative practices of majoritarianism of liberal democracy, or it may be a statement about identity by young adolescent schoolgirls who are coerced by the liberal democratic state to choose between the veil or their education when they want both. Or, of course, a matter of life or death under the dictates of the Taliban. And as Sabah Mahmood and others have argued, what is entirely absent from these responses is the experience of the veiled woman and conception of the self based on the relationship of the veil to the inner disposition of some wearers, where freedom lies in the movement inwards rather than outwards. This conception of the self has no relationship to liberal individualism or the embodied subject as a bearer of rights. It's a choice exercised not only outside of the normative prescriptions of gender equality, but also outside what I call the epistemic fishbowl of human rights and its very limited conception of freedom. Of freedom of the human subject and of the body. And I strongly suspect that what is so threatening is this articulation of a non-liberal, not illiberal, experience of freedom outside of the liberal constellation, and of a self or subject that is outside the terms and reach of liberal individualism and its discourse. Let me elaborate further on what at this point in the talk I describe as the conceit of human rights that embraces the determinate conception of the subject and drives specific understandings on how to be free. In the war launched in March 2003 against Afghanistan, I think it was, that some liberal scholars have described, in fact, as the first war of gender liberation. Representations of women unveiled, welcoming U.S. Marines masked more than they revealed. Again, Butler talks about this as how liberation is conditioned on the idea that these Marines were bringing freedom and liberation from an unjust, brutal regime. The images of women pulling back their veil and smiling is read as a welcoming and one of joy, where what was named as Operation Freedom, Enduring Freedom, finally comes to the rescue of those who ostensibly have never known what freedom means or who experience freedom partly through the removal of the veil. What's occluded in this context within which women are bearing their faces is the devastation wreaked by the war in Afghanistan, in a region relentlessly militarized over the last 35 years by superpowers at the time. The regrouping and re-establishment of the Taliban, as well as the complex politics that surrounds the veil in Afghanistan and elsewhere. 13 years on, the veil remains, violence against women and other civilians continues on a staggering scale, but receives less media attention, and the saviors have become indistinguishable from the perpetrators. Military interventions under the banner of gender liberation render invisible the unconscionable harms of war, and the lives lost, again, is ungrievable and unmourned, of women and countless others who become nothing more than disposable bodies in the mechanics of the art of war. The pluralities of the veil and its meanings are obscured by myopic responses to it that form part of the larger assumption about culture, where tradition and antiquity are regarded as primitive, during the colonial era, and continue to be viewed as inherently negative features of the third world, and they're used to make moral judgments about the other, as well as to deny her full subjectivity. And finally, I want to turn to the homosexual and the struggle for gay rights, where I'm going to make a similar argument, because you can see a similar thing happening. And I focus on this because of our feminist engagement with gender and the pluralizing of gender identity. The very idea that we all have a gender identity. Now, we are witnessing a polarized response to this subject on the global stage. At one end, there is an increased criminalization of queer lives, where not just the sex act, but the very identity of homosexuals are criminalized, such as in Nigeria, Uganda, and to a lesser extent in Russia. At the opposite end of the spectrum, rights claims have challenged the pathologizing and criminalizing of homosexuality, resulting in legal recognition in many countries. The ultimate culmination point of this struggle for legitimacy rests in the recognition of same-sex marriages. One can easily argue that it's always better to have legal recognition and also perhaps the option to get married, have children, and presumably, of course, further down the road to divorce, as opposed to having an active law that persecutes not only homosexuality but its very identity. Who can argue with that? How can anyone say life imprisonment for being gay should not be contested through a human rights challenge, that such a law is unjust and discriminatory? Well, you can't. Clearly, it's better not to be persecuted. But I want to nuance the response, which is what I've been trying to do through this talk. First, if same-sex marriage is permissible in Germany, US, Israel, Denmark, it cannot be based on this one-dimensional reasoning that these societies are just better, more civilized, mature than, say, Uganda and Nigeria. For instance, it's not Islamic orthodoxy, but Christian evangelicalism from the US that has driven the homophobic agenda in Uganda. This is Pastor Scott Lively, who's in fact leading the anti-gay agenda in Uganda, as well as Pastor Lou Engel, who actually supported the Kill the Gays bill. It was known as Kill the Gays bill, but because it provided the death sentence for gays in Uganda. The law was enacted, but was struck down by the Constitutional Court in 2014 on the grounds that there had not been a sufficient quorum in Parliament to enact the law, and so the law is being reintroduced. So the imposition of sanctions or withdrawal of aid by countries whose very citizens have advanced anti-gay agendas in the targeted countries really needs to be rigorously problematized. Second, a position that continues to associate freedom with the West while African countries and their leaders are cast as retrogressive and barbaric does not implicate the ways in which homophobia continues to circulate in Western liberal democracies. Abhorrence of homosexuality and the homosexual continues to exist as an ideological position across the divides. Examples, of course, I hate to keep picking on France, but France has been quite extraordinary in its big step backward on so many issues. But in France, there was a move to legalize same-sex marriages. It produced some of the largest protests in May 2013 that have ever been seen in Paris since the 1960s by those opposed to the law, and also saw an upsurge in violence in the gay community. Here the signs are Mama and Papa equals best interest of the child. And of course, most recently in Mississippi, that allows anti-gay discrimination, as well as in North Carolina and the controversy around transgendered washrooms. In this choice between criminality and legitimacy at one level, legitimacy is clearly preferable given the access it affords and the public standing and legibility for the subject. In April 2014, the transgender community in India was ecstatic over the Supreme Court's ruling that they were entitled to legal rights to health, education, and marriage, and to be included in the category of other unofficial government documents. The case reflects the struggle by excluded bodies to realize their desire for recognition and humanity through human rights. The desire seems beyond critique. It's a clear case of human rights being, to paraphrase Gayatri Spivak's words, something we cannot not want. But I add to this, of course, even though it cannot give us what we want. The conferment of legal recognition can move us in a direction of becoming a totalized response and invite regulation of these once radical subjectivities. They become eligible, possible, as well as livable, reproduced through the legal regulation and governance of difference. Of course, while this move, while different from one that criminalizes and outlaws, is also constraining. It's not self-evident that recognition and legitimacy through human rights results in equality and freedom, as I've discussed in all my earlier examples. There are costs. Thirdly, and a related point, is that the advocacy of gay and lesbian groups opposed to discrimination in Uganda and Nigeria and other countries may also be on terms that accept the idea that homophobia is endemic to Islam or to a civilizationally immature country. Such interventions have at times reproduced the binary between those societies that are seen as progressive and civilized, and those societies that remain in a constant state of transition until the human rights of their LGBT persons are secured. But such interventions, again, take us no closer to, or no further along the road to understanding the historical and colonial legacies and structural processes that produce those discriminations in the first place. Instead, a global, out-of-the-closet sexuality is presupposed as the way to be and constituted against or in opposition to a cultural other. It assumes something about gay rights and sexual equality and what it should look like. That is outness as opposed to the closet. And they further reinforce the fantasies and stereotypes, especially of Muslims and Arabs in the current moment. Like everywhere else in the world, sexual identity and practices in the Middle East and Muslim countries are diverse and plural, making it impossible to speak of a singular queer Arab or Muslim experience. This is from a queer Muslim photo project which represents the plurality. Despite this, the queer Arab body has become a site of conflict in a much larger war, as in the case of women's rights and to a lesser extent with LGBT rights. The West has waved the flag, often to garner support for current wars being waged in the Middle East. Recent footage of the Islamic State throwing a gay man off a tower in Tal Abyad, Syria, saw the Security Council convene its first ever meeting in 70 years on LGBT rights in August 2015. So once again, gay rights becomes embraced within a security discourse, but it's seemingly to justify interventions and the bombing. The end result is to leave the queer Arab with a dilemma: how to battle oppressive forces within their own communities while also resisting the global their oppression for broader military or political goals, and reinforce what Matua has called the savior, victim, savage narrative that informs so much of human rights advocacy. So in conclusion, I have 4 observations or proposals. Not comprehensive, but clearly meant to encourage debate and discussion. The first, human rights are shadowed by those who are not included, who cannot claim them, and who cannot be part of them. This is the dark side of human rights. They have their limits and circumscribe the domain in which they can operate. The end result is that they can only ever be an intervention rather than something transformative. Second, we will need to constantly deal with the fact that individuals or communities who are denied recognition and legal status want recognition through rights. But, and this is really the nuanced, careful point, this shouldn't limit us from interrogating and problematizing what is presumed to be a progressive project and how it may simultaneously trigger coercive norms that operate to exclude other disadvantaged and discriminated bodies and reproduce civilizational and cultural divides. Coming back to Cologne, the Cologne assaults and the representations of the Delhi rape in India's daughters, the structuring of bodies along fixed and rigid racial, gender, sexual, cultural lines is not a recipe for freedom, but of the continuation and reinforcement of deeply destructive binaries. So the third point here is to challenge, the third challenge here is to demolish these binaries, to understand that violence inflicted on women in Cologne or in Delhi were not random events perpetrated by uncivilized hordes or illiterate poor men, but part of the widespread discrimination and violence against women. At the same time, we need to resist the universalizing zeal of human rights that features in gender and sexual rights advocacy and becomes part of a hegemonic and often imperial torchbearer of freedom, leaving us with results that can be politically divisive and take us no further in the really further in the direction of unfreedom. And finally, moving beyond Cologne means moving more than moving beyond the binaries. It means being prepared to learn and even being remade through our encounters with difference in others. To be global, to know that there may be conceptions of freedom that are not linked to embodiment or liberal individualism, and to push back against human rights' hegemonic thrust and monopoly over how to be and how to be free in the world, as I briefly discussed in the context of the veil. Such understandings of the self that flourish outside of the liberal imaginary and its deep attachment to the body are found in the rituals, for example, of transgendered persons, here represented as getting ready and dressed, preparing themselves to wed this charming person, who is the transgender deity Iravan. And they do this once a year under the full moon in a South Indian state, where freedom is experienced through the disembodied, ecstatic registers of their dance, which represents the connection between the two. And there are almost 9 festivals which recognize and where transgendered and where they're enabled to and permitted to perform their identity in this more frenzied, trance-like way and ritualized way. Or it can be found in the homoerotic desires expressed in Sufi poetry, music, and dance, here represented in the Dervish dance. An imminent as well as transcendent experience of liberation through a relationship between the subject and her inner self. Or in the philosophical poetry of the 13th century Kashmiri, naked mystic Lal Ded, who left her abusive marriage and household to seek freedom in the self and liberation from the body. The potential of such spaces calls for a much more robust and engaged conversation that can produce more imaginative and creative possibilities for precarious bodies, but not just for precarious bodies, than has hitherto been even permissible or possible. In the end, I suggest, it's nothing short of an epistemic reorientation. Thank you.